Thank you. It's great to be back. Thank you, Christian and IPAM, for organizing. This is, again, these workshops have always been very stimulating in many ways. The whole interdisciplinarity here is fantastic. So I encourage everyone to participate, ask questions, and so on. And Carol, thank you very much for an amazing introduction. You've done all the work, so I don't have to explain anything about equity and justice and the whole issues involved with that. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about a specific engineering problem, which is the redesign of transit networks at an urban level. And we're going to do this in the context of a real large-scale system, which is the greater Chicago area. There's several angles to our exploration here. And it is an exploration because I don't know that we really have definitive conclusions about how to best, say, measure equity. It all goes back to what is your purpose, what is the underlying policy and objective, and so on. I'll be presenting an application in this sort of redesign of transit networks. And I say redesign because we're focused on one new important additional element, which is the role of autonomous vehicles, particularly shared autonomous mobility services, and how those might integrate with transit service. There has been quite a bit of work in the literature. Several people in this audience have been contributing to this area as well, kind of recognizing that shared autonomous mobility services can be an important complement to transit. What we have seen so far, even without autonomy, is that they are a strong competitor to transit, and transit has, in fact, or conventional transit has been struggling, and not only because of COVID, but even before COVID, in many cities, particularly in North America. So this is work that is joint with Meredith Raymer, who is here with us today, and Max Ing, who is currently visiting at the Technical University of Munich. And it's also in collaboration with the Argonne National Lab, their traffic analysis group. Okay. All right, so some equity concepts, and I'm focusing kind of narrowly, I guess, on transportation investment in the transit arena. And so let's say you have a given system. We typically examine the level of service that is offered in terms of several metrics. We've heard about several. So you have a vector of impact, C1, C2, C3, etc., that are going to be distributed across the residence. So for a given configuration or for a contemplated design, we typically evaluate what the impacts are going to be in terms of travel time, etc. Those are grouped spatially by income group, ethnicity, and we saw a good list earlier of what groups one might consider in this case. And for an existing system, we may have a given distribution of these impacts, F0, so cumulative distribution, multidimensional. We now invest some amount B, and after investment, we may examine then the distribution of these impacts, think accessibility or various dimensions of accessibility that could reflect an improved situation or have in some way a better distribution of these particular impacts. Okay? So then we ask, does investment improve equity when, say, it brings previously lagging entities to the previous mean or benchmark level? And that is, in fact, the notion of sufficiency. Okay. One issue with that potentially is that it gets confounded with self-selectivity, because self-selectivity in terms of where people choose to locate. In particular, the desert is one extreme example of that, but people choose to live in certain areas, recognizing that they may be more difficult to get to in some ways. And in fact, in many ways, the private automobile has enabled or opened up many more locational opportunities. But if we have a notion of sufficiency at an urban area, do we, again, what is an acceptable or sufficient level for everyone? But that's certainly, is a notion that could be entertained in this framework. Or does it improve when the new relative impact, let's say the improvement that we get per dollar invested, is somehow equal across the population? Because the first and the second are not necessarily equivalent. The third one is when we look at the new distribution itself, and is it more equitable than what we had previously? And this is, again, using a similar metric as the base case. And would that mean then that the investment impact is inequitable? Because, in fact, to achieve that, if you start from a distribution that is not equitable, or that is more concentrated or serving a certain subgroup or spatial unit more than another, to rectify that, you end up investing unequally in a sense. But these, from a design perspective, these are going to have very different implications for what kind of objective function we might have, for example, and so on. What we do is, again, we're not providing a final or comprehensive approach yet. This is very much still work in progress, which is why this is an excellent environment for us to be discussing it, is how do we capture and quantify equity in the context of urban transport mobility? So we're looking at practical engineering or planning measures that one could use. And what metrics could planner use then to characterize both existing systems and evaluate proposed design configurations? And the second question, the subtext here, is can we make transit systems actually more equitable by integrating new on-demand shared mobility services with autonomous vehicles in future redesigned transit systems? And the answer to that is a resounding yes, as we will see later. And so we're going to examine these questions through an application through the greater Chicago area. The method is to compare travel times and accessible opportunities of various zones under model scenarios. Our contributions are conceptually, we're again assessing equity improvement that is brought by multimodal transit network redesign, specifically with shared autonomous mobility services. Methodologically, we're analyzing changes in horizontal and vertical equity with metrics that we're going to be presenting, and one can argue that from a policy standpoint, we're evaluating the impacts of SAMs on transit equity. There are other contributions on the transit network design side, but that's not really our focus here, though the methodology is critical to what we're doing. Okay, some of the measures that we're considering transit travel time versus driving time. And again, Carol brought that out very clearly earlier. In this case, it's weighted by prevailing demand patterns. So this is the experienced travel time, not sort of a hypothetical one for users that may not be making those trips. And we examine access to opportunities within a certain time range, and these are common measures that are used in the literature. So what opportunities exist within, say, 45 minutes or within 60 minutes, and another measure is using kind of an intervening opportunities type model in there. And for those, we look at just differences in magnitudes. We look at transit to driving ratios, and we use Lorentz curve, which is a very convenient way, actually, of looking at the distribution of opportunities with the corresponding Gini's index, and I will define those for those who are not familiar with them. And we've heard about kind of horizontal, vertical equity. So for vertical, we drill more into various income groups and so on. Okay, so just in terms of travel time, then we do have a zonal structure here. This is, at some level we do work with agent models, but in this application, we're kind of more aggregate. We've aggregated from the agent models that we use to zonal levels, and we define the zones ourselves. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And so for any given zone, there is a measure, which is the travel time under scenario S for associated with that zone, and it is weighted by the demand between I and J for each of the measures that we consider. So it's a travel time between zone I and zone J under scenario S multiplied by the demand, and this is summed over all of the destinations divided by the total, the total demand out of that particular zone. And you can then take the travel time ratio, that is transit to auto, where we compute a similar, that measure under a given scenario to the measure computed under the 4 here is because we have a scenario 4, and scenario 4 is the auto driving only, so that's why there's a 4 here. Okay, that's a fairly simple, straightforward measure, just in terms of travel time. And then in terms of accessible opportunities, and I'll show you some of the, I guess, the types of opportunities that are included in here include health, education, employment, obviously number of jobs, and so on. And I'll have a list of those in the application. But you have the number of opportunities within a certain threshold distance. That's T is the travel time threshold, and we then, again, accumulate those for a given zone I under a particular scenario, and this is for threshold T, that's AOS, and we accumulate that over all of the opportunities. And then there is a similar ratio here relative to auto, that is accessibility by auto versus, then that's, again, your scenario 4. And we consider also a score with gravity weighting in this case, where you have the weight WSIJ, which is it's essentially a measure of travel impedance, similar to formulations of the gravity model. Lorentz curve, for those who are not familiar with it, originally proposed to look at income inequality. And so what you're plotting is the cumulative number of people from lowest to highest income versus the cumulative share of the income earned. And so this is where you get measures like, 5% of the population have 90% of the total income. And so that curve is the Lorentz curve, and the Gini's coefficient is going to, and so of course, the 45-degree line is the line of equality, and the Gini's coefficient is going to be the area between the Lorentz curve and the line of equality over the total area, A plus B, that we have here. And this is just an example of that applied to transit, where we're looking at job access within 45 minutes of existing transit. And in this case, this is within 45 minutes of redesigned transit. And so you have, again, the cumulative share of the population versus the, in terms of the opportunities that they can access. And so you could see here, we go from a Gini index of 0.51 to a Gini index of 0.2, reflecting a more equitable access to opportunities. Okay? And so these are the definitions for the Gini's index with the measures that we're using. And this is based on a paper by Del Bosque and Curry in transport geography, using Lorentz curves to assess public transport. So this is not a new measure, we're just applying it in a somewhat different way. So going back to the Chicago application, we're working, as I said, with a transit network redesign procedure framework, which does not include equity explicitly in the objective function. Later, we will hear from my colleague, Marco Ni, about a network design process that is explicitly using equity. Here, we're kind of evaluating it as an impact given a transit system that is redesigned using what I'm going to say the typical objectives that we use in this process. Okay? So a few years back, we introduced a methodology where we were solving for frequencies on existing, primarily bus routes, jointly with the fleet size for joint autonomous, for shared autonomous mobility services. What we are doing now is, in fact, redesigning the entire system, that is all the routes, including infrastructure, et cetera, with shared autonomous mobility services. And it consists of, so this is a high-level design problem, which then subsequently goes to more detail. The work I'm presenting today is primarily at this high level of network design. So where we start with initial clustering of the zones, we then optimize zonal connection here, from which we then go to specific routes. And the level at which I'm examining the equity aspects is at the level of the zonal connection optimization system. Okay. So we start by clustering our area. And so this is the city of Chicago right here. North there is Wisconsin. Here you have Indiana. So it's a very large, the greater Chicago area is a pretty large area that has over 8.5 million people, a lot of trips here, and the initial clustering into zones is primarily focused on trips, and so areas that have high density of travel tend to have smaller zones. Those that have lower density of travel have larger zones. But the innovation is essentially here, the network design innovation, is that at each of these zones here is kind of blown or exploded into zones associated, or nodes associated with each of the modes. So we have rail, we have, which is regional rail, we have metro rail, we have bus rapid transit, we have essentially regular bus, and we have shared autonomous vehicles. What we are building then, so this is, say, Zone I and Zone J, we're building the connections between those, and effectively through the formulation, we're determining which arcs are going to be built in that framework, that is, whether it's rail arcs or bus arcs or only SAV. But within that, we also have the feeder concept. So the transfer here is capturing for us that I'm using shared autonomous vehicles to connect to rail, or that I'm using shared autonomous vehicles to connect to bus, and that's all internalized in the formulation. So that representation is kind of the key to what we're doing here. And what it is, the view that we take in this redesign is more one of a mobility as a service, where the transit agency is operating to provide whatever level of accessibility or whatever the objective function is that we're using, and I will show you that. And they are operating the shared autonomous mobility services. So that's part of their, of their service. And they're trying to provide that service, or the overall service, in the most effective way. And part of what we envision really is that for transit pretty much to survive, if you wish, financially, it has to focus on what it does best, which is move a lot of people in high-density corridors, but a lot of the sort of more suburban, et cetera, could be better served by shared mobility services.
Just a quick question. So when you talk about redesign, are you also considering the cost of abandoning or removing lines that will not be served?
Not the cost of abandoning lines, more like we may be adding lines essentially, but there is no abandonment cost per se to just like leave a line. That does not go in there. It would be captured through the user costs associated with that. So the user cost from abandonment would be captured, obviously, because they would not have that service. But generally in this formulation, we're giving them a different service. Usually better, but not all the time, as I will show you. Okay, and then we use continuous approximations to compute ARC costs from geospatial demand and modal characteristics, covering door-to-door costs and the costs that are included from a user standpoint. We have access, waiting, transfer, and writing, and so there is an explicit cost of transfer that is included, as the behavioral literature suggests we should do. From an operator's perspective, we have the operating costs, of course, and if you were investing, then in new links, of course, that is going to be included as well, and emissions are also included on the operator side. Okay. All right, so that zonal connection optimization formulation is a multi-commodity network flow model where zonal connectivity and infrastructure decisions are integer, but then the flows are assigned by continuous variables. So the assignment is embedded here, but part of what allows us to be able to solve this problem in pretty much closed form is that we're doing the assignment as system optimum assignment. And part of the logic is high level, long term, one agency, you can optimally assign users to that. And in continuing work, we're in fact replacing it by then agent models where the agents are choosing what they're doing, so on. At this level, it's SO. And so we end up with a non-convex problem with linearized constraints. And this is a large problem for 50 clusters. In fact, we've been working with 80 clustered zones. For 50 clusters, 6 modes, there we have approximately 400,000 continuous variables and 10,000 integer variables. And then our objective then, what we're including are in terms of travel costs, we have the starting cost, that is the access cost. We have the interzonal line haul travel. We have transfer and then access at the end from users' perspective. And those include waiting times and so on. And then on the main lines, we have the operating costs and the emissions. Well, we have those both on the main lines and on the feeders. Operating costs and emissions are included. So it's a fairly elaborate formulation, but nothing explicitly about equity in this formulation. Okay. And some of the constraints, of course, include the usual mass flow balance, mass balance, etc., that we're going to have at both origins, destinations, and nodes that are neither origins nor destinations. And there is then an infrastructure budget, transit capacity, infrastructure sufficiency notion, and bidirectional links. And then for interzonal SAVs, we have link capacity and fleet size that are considered there. All right, so in this case study, we actually applied it to a case with 80 clusters. Originally, we were developing with 50. We found we were able to solve it, so we went up to 80 zones, 8.32 million in population. And if you look at the city itself, this here is the loop. This is the central core of Chicago. And around it, up to here, is the city itself in green. And so Austin and Englewood are neighborhoods. These are, so typically, within the city, west and south are, quote, the poor sort of areas. If you look at the, the more northwest as well as by the lake, you have typically more affluent areas. And if you continue, you look at the suburbs, the northern suburbs and northwest suburbs tend to be much more affluent than other areas. And so the suburbs are connected primarily by, and so what you see here also are the rail lines. And in Chicago, there's actually 5 different transit agencies, but there are 2 rail agencies. There is Metro, which is regional rail, and there's CTA, which is metro type urban rail. And some areas like town of Evanston, where I live, have both Metro and CTA. Makes it more accessible, obviously. Suburbs, as I said, tend to have higher median household income, such as Schaumburg, for example. All right. So this is the spatial distribution of different attributes. You could see here the distribution of population. You could see the number of trips that are originating from each of the 80 zones. You can look at the income distribution, and this is what I was mentioning there in terms of some of the northernmost suburbs being being of higher income. And of course, if you look strictly at downtown, it's very high income because these are the nice condos, etc. And so downtown Chicago does this pretty well, but then you kind of look at the southern part, and south and west are where you have a lot of the lower income issues. You look at the poverty percentage, you see where the income is lower is where you have more poverty. If you look at the job opportunities, that's pretty interesting. So in downtown itself, you have a lot of the tech companies, financial, etc. And then that decreases. But then you have this ring here of suburbs where you have a lot of jobs, a lot of activity, education services. Not surprisingly, this is Evanston, where Northwestern is located. And you look at health services. Again, and so Evanston tends to score really highly because of the university, etc. And this is the distribution of retail businesses. And so these are the kind of opportunities that we are including in our opportunity measure that we're examining. Okay. All right. So now what we've considered is 3 different scenarios. Yes, Joe.
Did you segment your population by income level as well?
Yes, but we have it at the aggregate level for each zone. So, yeah.
Evanston is a residential campus, right?
I'm sorry?
Is Evanston a residential campus? Northwestern.
Yes, it has students who live there, yeah. But there's also a campus downtown, which is the medical school, the law school, are downtown. And that's not residential per se, that's more the hospital, etc. Okay. So the scenarios that we have, 3 transit redesign, and our scenario 4 is really the current driving option. This is just auto, pretty much. And that we did not model. This is out of Google, pretty much. We queried Google and got that from Google Maps. So the first scenario is a redesigned bus network. And in this redesign, we're simply taking the so we're across the board, we're keeping the legacy the rail infrastructure. We're not removing it, we're keeping it there. And in scenario 1, we're just redesigning the bus network, no shared autonomous mobility services. And we're actually using that as our as our benchmark rather than the actual system, because we wanted to then compare this to a system where we redesigned the bus network with shared autonomous vehicles, okay? So that we comparing sort of on a similar basis, we have an optimized bus network, and this is now optimized but with SAVs. Because if we had taken the existing system as it stands, then partly when we look at this, part of it may be optimizing the bus network, another part may be SAV. So we're controlling for that one by re-optimizing the bus network here. So in scenario 2, as I said, the main difference is that we're introducing SAVs. There really is no infrastructure investment per se. It's all services that are being redeployed. Scenario 3, where we have an investment of $15 billion for infrastructure. And that includes commuter rail, metro rail, and bus rapid transit. Now it turns out, and Meredith reminded me, that 15 billion is the CTA's 10-year budget for capital improvement. So it's not an outlandish number. It's what they actually would be investing. And in both of these, we have express and local buses. So we can, under the redesign with shared autonomous vehicles, we can have express buses as we can here when we are redesigning. So in all cases, we're allowing for express buses to be sort of more express bus service to be introduced. That's and so the feeder then under both of these scenarios, or a lot of the feeder services within a zone become shared autonomous vehicles, yes.
Quick question there, the 15 billion, would that also involve the investment in the shared autonomous vehicles?
No, that's pretty much
come from?
Free. In the sense, that's pretty much because effectively there is no investment in new infrastructure. Just as we're not including the cost of new buses, for example. Okay, so we're not including the vehicle cost in this formulation. Now, let me tell you where that comes in. In the last step that I had shown in my design framework, that's where the vehicle costs come in. Those are relatively much smaller compared to the budgets that we're talking about. So when we're doing frequency allocation to different routes and size of the SAV fleet, because there's another step where that all gets refined, that then is this is where the cost of the vehicles are included. So we're not completely ignoring them. It's just, it's a later step. Yes, Carol?
Then I'm still confused. So how do you limit the amount of buses you can run or the amount of autonomous vehicles you can run? Where does it take?
Okay, so at this level, we have kind of a level of service a certain frequency that we're assuming. So we're starting from the existing, the existing bus routes, but we're creating new connections pretty much. But you're right, there is no limit, but then we're not optimizing the frequencies here. We're assuming a typical level of service at this strategic level. Again, the frequency allocation is going to come later. It's a different problem. Okay.
So in your modeling framework, how do you differentiate TNC and SAV? I guess the cost is different, but any other thing?
That's a good. Well, the cost is different, and then so yes, okay. That's one of the main differences is that the feeders here are handled by transit, not by TNC. So TNCs are available, but they're not really being optimized. They're not being deployed by the agency. We assume that they're available, essentially. So that could be provided as a link, but they're not, in this case, they're kind of integral to the design problem. Okay, so the original demand came from an activity-based model, but we did not carry that resolution through the design problem. And it has the modes included. We can walk to local transit, we can walk to premium transit, drive to local transit, drive to premium transit. So that's all of these. So the total demand that we're designing for is the sum of these modes in sort of the activity-based model, and that comes out to a weekly demand of 4.16 million trips. And the other thing here is we are essentially designing for fixed demand under all of the scenarios. We're not incorporating variable demand here. That's going to be at the more detailed level subsequently. Okay, so let's start looking at distributions here. We start looking first at travel times, so this is under the three scenarios here. Bus only, redesign bus with SAVs, and then scenario 3 is where we are investing all that information. And this is the travel time by transit. This is the travel time ratio. What we could see is that there is, not a huge difference really when you are comparing these distributions here, and even sort of under scenario 3, we're getting very similar distributions of these travel times, and of course the inequity that kind of existed is not totally being addressed from that standpoint, and similar kind of image emerges here with when we're looking at the travel time ratios. If we look at access to opportunities, then the opportunities that we're including a number of jobs, healthcare facilities, retail and retail jobs, and education locations within time bounds of 45 and 60 minutes. And so just to kind of illustrate, under the same scenario, how much more you are capturing with just 15-minute difference in terms of a threshold. That really, again, you go back to sufficiency, ultimately you can get a very different conclusion as you move that particular threshold, okay? All right, so this is summarizing, the darker the better. The solid dark blue is scenario 4, driving. Okay, in terms of, and this is for 45 minutes, 60 minutes, and the gravity-weighted measures for accessibility to opportunities. And so what we can see here, again, as you are comparing, if we take the 60-minute, for example, you can really see how much more accessibility we're getting with the redesign of the bus network with SAVs. So that difference here, that's SAV impact pretty much, okay? Because we're redesigning the bus network without the SAVs, and in this case, with the shared autonomous mobility services. And with scenario 3, where we're investing in more sort of conventional, sort of more infrastructure, we're not seeing a huge change there, but a really big one here with SAVs. And again, comparing it to what you get with auto. So the gravity model captures similar ones, but I find this one here to be quite instructive. And if you look at it at the 45-minute level, there is, again, some more darkening overall, but it's the 60 threshold that really makes a difference.
Sorry, so for the scenario 4, so for this driving with SAVs, is there any limitation built in terms of traffic congestion or anything like that?
For scenario 4, this is actual. This is sort of actual network, pretty much. This says you could get it off of Google. So this is not simulated. This is that total demand, essentially using travel times that we get from Google Maps.
So this is assuming that the extra cars that you're putting on the road can go as they're going out.
Again, we did not really assign that traffic in this case, so we're not. We're simply wanted to compare it to the prevailing auto driving times.
To the traffic
Exactly. Yep. Because that's sort of the benchmark that we're looking at in terms of the level of service that everybody is getting through transit. So how does it compare to the main competition, which is auto? And that's why we're using it. This is not saying let's put everybody in autos. That would be a different question. It's just relative to benchmark. Yes?
Did you try scenario 3 without SAV?
Scenario 3 without SAVs. No, I don't believe. We might have, but that was not a focus. And I do not have those results. But okay.
It's very powerful.
Sorry?
It's very powerful.
Yeah.
You can save $50 million.
But I'll show you another metric later that actually can capture that better, in my view. Yes.
But don't consider private cars, right? So in scenario 4, there's maybe no reason for private cars because autonomous vehicles.
No. Scenario 4 is travel time today by private car.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
But the private cars are
benchmark.
not included in the other scenarios.
In the other scenarios, we're only looking at transit, but looking at it for the trips that are currently using transit. We're not doing capture from auto. We don't have mode choice or mode shifting. We have if the transit agency was redesigning for the current usage, what would happen?
Okay, but you do not look at demand shifts that if
Nope.
somebody has a very bad connection, he would take for private
That's
car.
right. We're not. That's again in our
That would be
continuing
the
work.
assignment later on.
That's in our continuing work. Okay, and so this is now looking at the Lorentz curves, with going to the measures, again, the 45-minute opportunity index, the 60-minute opportunity index, and the gravity-weighted one. And you could see that there is, again, just looking at the different measures themselves, looks much more equitable under the 60-minute opportunities than it does under the 45-minute opportunities. And gravity-weighted is giving a fairly, again, equitable index here. And you could see as we go from 1 to 2, there is some improvement in 45 minutes, but it's essentially about the same, really, by this particular metric. Yes?
Would you take the opportunities outside your study area into account?
No, we're only looking at opportunity within.
So then expanding,
Yes.
increasing travel time, of course, in the end is.
Yes, we're not looking at people going into Wisconsin or whatever. We're just kind of staying within that area. That's a good point. Okay. Here by this measure, we see increasing access across scenarios. We saw earlier in looking at the spatial distribution, but when you look at the kind of the Lorentz curves here, which is giving us the fraction of population and their experience, we're pretty not picking up that much difference. Okay. Which was surprising because some of earlier work was actually capturing that. Was there a question? Okay. All right, so this is now, but if you look at Chicago only, that is the city, remember the area has all the suburbs, etc. If you focus on the city itself, which does have clear distinction between some of the poor areas and higher income areas and accessibility areas, what you find there is much clearer improvement if you look at the city when you go from scenario 1 to scenario 2, for example. But then to scenario 3, you're not getting as much because those investments are really helping more of the suburbs, really, because they're in rail and bus and BRT and so on. You could see, again, under 45 minutes, with SAVs, you're kind of approaching the driving Gini coefficient there. If you look at 60 minutes, the 60-minute opportunities, again, you see a clear improvement with pretty much comparable to driving for the 60-minute opportunity measure, and at the gravity model level, what's just not kept, it's just totally insensitive in this case. And that's part of what we're exploring, which measures are going to be more sensitive or pick up some of these changes. Okay. Yes?
Why is the coefficient going up in scenario 4 in the 60-minute and the gravity weighted?
I'm sorry?
Why is it going up from 0.06?
Which one? Scenario 4?
Let's say in the 60-minute scenario.
Because essentially there is much more equity in terms of what you can reach within 60 minutes than what you can reach within 45 minutes. And if you go down to 30 minutes, there's going to be even less equity. But at 60 minutes, then you're capturing much more in the system. And again, that's kind of shows the importance of the thresholds and the different conclusions you get with that.
I'm surprised the gravity weighted model doesn't show much difference. I would say it's more sensitive to.
Yeah, it could be the impedance metric. Partly what the impedance metric is doing is smoothing things out. It's controlling for differences. It seems to have more of a smoothing effect from what we have tested so far. So I'm not too fixed, frankly, on the gravity formulation, but we're carrying it because we have all those results. It's probably worth digging deeper into it. Okay, this is now looking at the accessible opportunities ratio. That is the ratio of transit opportunities to auto opportunities. Again, you could see more of the differences here in the city itself. In terms of going from scenario 1 to 2 to 3, what we're seeing here, in terms of that ratio, is, again, this is an improvement in that ratio. So that's what, that's reflective here of the impact of these different measures. Now, you pick it up also at the 45-minute one, but again, 60 seems to be the sort of the clearest indicator, whereas the kind of gravity is, again, it's smearing things. So I'm not focused too much on that. So this is now looking at the changes in spatial equity. We're looking at the difference in the travel time in a given zone. In this case, it's between scenario 2 and scenario 1. And so the brown is actually negative. It goes from -2 to +2 here. And if we look, so this is 2 minus scenario 1. So there is a, again, reduction in the travel time. And this is from scenario 3 to scenario 2. And I guess what I'm saying here is the blue one is where things may have gotten worse, actually, compared to between scenario 1 and scenario 2. And if you look at the difference in the travel time ratios, that is transit to auto, again, similar sort of conclusion in terms where we have losses where things may have gotten worse. And so this is looking at this is the cumulative distribution of the weighted travel time change. Cumulative distribution where we're using the zones, but with the population that is in each zone. So this is percent of the population in terms of the benefit that they are getting. And so again, it goes from -8, that's an improvement of 8 minutes to, and so we have here just a tiny fraction that where things got worse, and it is, those two areas that we have here. This is now scenario 3 over scenario 2, much less improvement. So we are really getting a lot of bang for our buck, basically. In this case, not as much when we're looking at the 15 billion that have been invested, again, relative to this situation. Okay. And, one can drill and look at equity and travel times, ask how the reduction may be distributed across the income groups. This, I believe, is for the city, and these are income bins from lower income to higher income, and we could see here that lower income is benefiting more than higher income, which is what we would like to see, though that was not explicitly incorporated in the formulation. Okay. All right, this is looking at changes in, again, in the accessible opportunities, this is comparing here, comparing scenario 2 and this is the difference in that score between scenario 2 and scenario 1 for the 45-minute measure, the 60-minute measure, and the gravity-weighted one. And we're looking at the score on top and the ratio, that is ratio of the opportunity score with transit to the opportunity score with auto. And this is, again, here comparing 3 to 2. And again, we could, looking at just the difference initially in the opportunity score, and this, so we could see an increase. So green is an increase, pretty high in the city, but there's an outer area where, in fact, there is a reduction. That blue one. So it's not uniform with the 45-minute index, but you go to the 60-minute index, and that is much greener, altogether in terms of the difference in opportunity score with the redesign, and the gravity weighted gets all green, which is good. And if we look at scenario 3 to scenario 2, the difference is, it's less. The improvement is not as high as what we're getting between 1 and 2. Okay. And this is looking now at the percent change in accessible opportunities. We've discussed that. What I want to show is this. Okay. This is the distribution of gains versus losses. And this is the cumulative distribution, scenario 2 over scenario 1 with the 45-minute opportunities measure. And we could see that there are losses, but there's a lot more gain. But there's still losses. So this is sort of a kind of a classic prospect. But what's interesting is that, again, you look at the scenario 2 over scenario 1, kind of the level of losses here, numerically, in terms of magnitude, is comparable. You may have a higher fraction, but then there are many more that have obtained, bigger benefits. So, whereas scenario 3 over scenario 2 has many zones that are just, or large fraction that's just not seeing any change in opportunity. And you look at the 60-minute one, and the nice part with 60-minute is the losses are infinitesimally small, very, very small. Mostly it's in the gain sort of arena. And when you look at the at 3 to 2, again, a large fraction is just not getting very much from that. And this is the gravity weighted one. Again, the differences seem to be dampened. And so to me, that's pretty interesting because I'd like to know in a given situation who gains and who loses. And essentially, with the 60-minute metric, very few are losing, but some are losing in relative terms. And that becomes part of the equity discussion, I believe, in this case, when some are actually doing worse. And that suggests to me that in my formulation, I would want to control for something like this, make sure that at least nobody loses, because that's never good when somebody is losing something that they currently have in my design. But we did not explicitly include a constraint on that, but if I were to now sort of reformulate, I probably would incorporate that. Okay, and we hadn't sort of noticed that until we plotted these distributions last night. Okay.
Sorry, if I may.
Yes.
Can you please explain me why there is someone losing? How?
Because the objective function is the total. It's the overall. And so what that means is we have shifted away some services so whereas they may have had a certain line that may have been replaced in the redesign by something different.
You optimize the buses.
We're re-optimizing all the routes.
And scenario 2. And in scenario 2, you add a service.
We add, but no, we're re-optimizing everything with the new service.
So
we're not exactly. Yeah, we're not fixing that, yeah. So that's why. So some have, because it's serving many more by shifting that service basically. So, Jose?
That leads to a political problem.
Correct.
Most likely,
correct.
Most influential, communities in the city are going to be the ones that can use their transit service for 3 minutes, and they're going to raise hell for that.
I agree, except nobody looks at these distributions, but that's another question. I don't think they. But I would. This is why, to me, this suggests I should constrain for it, and it wouldn't be very difficult to do that.
So when you say, having just discovered this, you want to build this into the model, there are sort of two ways in which one could think about doing that. Is, you don't want anyone to switch from being positive to being negative. And then there's a question of what it means to be individually, non-improving, which is much harder and much more demanding, much more restrictive. And I was just curious, as you think about what you want to do next, which of those Or there's even a middle thing of you want the curves to be dominated as well. So those are three different range of scenarios. So they give a sense of what what's in range of what you can actually do, and B, what you think is the right experiment to do.
I do not want to keep losses, so losses have to disappear.
Okay.
So, which is why
That's the minimum.
this you don't show in a public meeting. This you will show. Okay, that's enough.
But it's different to say that if I look at the curve, that if I overlaid them, that I actually have parts of the curve that are more negatively, less positively concentrated than there. And that's also something you might not want to show at a public meeting overall. People would less understand that that's a problem.
Yeah.
And that's still different from the individual degradation of service, which is what people actually feel, which is what if you sort of think about implementing something, just to say that, well, you were just in the bad percentage that actually has worse service, that's not so,
You cannot take anything away.
Yeah.
But in the context of redesign, in a system that is initially unequal or unequitable, then it is acceptable that some are going to get more than others, as long as you don't take anything away. So some areas, you see that they are well served with the initial system, but then others are not, and there is clearly then more investment in these areas, and that's underlying the whole justice principle, I guess.
But that's still a different level of distinction
Yes.
overall in terms of that relative to the individual. I mean, it's one to say that to build in a constraint that at an individual level, the quality of service will not degrade, rather than saying that as I look at those curves, which just says that your role in the distribution has been taken over by somebody else, and distributionally, they wanted the new one dominates. So they're still.
I get it. So I produce the tools so that we can discuss these questions.
I guess the question is, it seems much harder to produce the tools to know how to do the individual dominance versus the population dominance. And I was just wondering if you had a sense of whether you had the tools to actually
when we do agent-based, full agent-based simulation, then we have it down to the household level.
Okay, great.
That tool exists, and then this is now a proxy of what I could extract from that population level information. Okay. All right. So anyway, this is exactly what I was hoping these will do is get some conversation going, because there are trade-offs, and ultimately, as I said, at a first level, I can have a constraint in my model to preclude these kind of situations. Yes.
I just maybe wanted to challenge some of that thinking that you never want to take anything away from anyone. Because how are we ever going to get a more equitable society if we never take anything away from anyone?
That's why I'm an engineer.
I'm not a philosopher.
That's why I'm an engineer. I'm not a politician.
The reality is that we are living in a political system. In essence, basically, one step or half a step, is better than nothing. And basically, this is the reality. You see?
Unless we do what we do in the US, we print money.
Also depends who you're taking something away from, as you said earlier.
Maybe you should be a politician.
Right, we print money and we solve it, right? Okay, so this is looking at vertical equity here, looking at accessible opportunities by income group. And this is for the entire area. And so the income bins are on top. And then what we have here are the different scenarios. And that big one that's sticking out, of course, is scenario 4. That's the driving scenario, where you're accessible. Whatever accessibility measure you use, you're very high as a benchmark, and you could see the values for different scenarios. So what you're really kind of doing is blue to blue, red to red across the income levels. And truth is, we're not seeing here very much improvement. So if you look at the overall area, there is in the lower income group a little bit more of an improvement, but it's not clear that at the higher income groups there is much of a loss. What's more interesting is if you look at it in the city only in Chicago, then there is a kind of more equitable story in the sense that you look at the improvements that one is getting a little bit more in the lower income categories for scenario 2 in particular, and I think that's really what we're looking at here. And so we do have a decreasing improvement across income, but for the highest income, it kind of goes up again, and that may be a distortion that is due to the downtown area, because downtown is high income, relatively speaking, and it does have an improvement in accessibility. Almost anything you do transit-wise is going to help your downtown. But if you, so that may explain why this is higher. But then kind of you're seeing sort of a decrease there across income groups. Same as you look at the 60-minute, we see that, but only for the largest group sort of goes up. And again, I think that's the sort of CBD effect here. We're also looking at, this is changes in vertical equity. We're plotting essentially scenario 1 versus scenario 2 for the different zones or the different neighborhoods. And in yellow is Chicago City, in blue are the suburbs. And what we're seeing here is that a lot of the improvement under scenario 2 relative to scenario 1 seems to be, that we're getting it in Chicago neighborhoods and city neighborhoods that tend to be on the poorer side. And we've kind of drilled, more specifically, and I don't have time to go into all of those, but we're seeing that in some of the poorer neighborhoods that have actually done better. And it's kind of illustrating some of these tools here, actually. Okay, all right. So let me try and conclude. And, yep, I think I've reached my time here. Perfect. Okay, so transit redesign with shared autonomous mobility services can improve equity. Not improves. How much depends on kind of what type of equity measure one might be using, as we saw. The measures that one may be using for evaluation. The reason this happens is because it's bridging the gap in opportunity access between transit users and driving, really, and it's providing a more flexible mode. More flexibility tends to, in this case, give you more equity, actually. And this is shown in the ratios of travel time and opportunity access, and it reduces inequality to opportunity access across the different zones, and we captured that in the Lawrence curve and the Gini's index. What we have also notice is that a discrepancy in equity improvement is shown between suburbs and the city. In some of the suburbs, we've had a drastic improvement in opportunity access because of current low levels of coverage. So there's more of an increase in opportunity but more increased opportunity access for areas closer to the city. And in the city, again, general improvement in opportunity access. Areas currently underserved by transit show the bigger improvements, and these are the southern areas. But one thing also that we've noted is really that the bigger investment here is not producing nearly as much benefit as the simpler one, which is to allow the flexibility with SAV, sort of redesigning the bus network, keeping pretty much the infrastructure, but allowing the more flexible mode to replace essentially a lot of transit service, which then can be sort of redeployed along more productive interventions. And it's still preliminary. It's only one case study with one particular formulation, but it allows us to start advancing this. So many limitations, of course. This is modeled work. And here we've focused primarily on connectivity, this high-level design problem without kind of incorporating frequency, ease of access, which are particularly important in assessing transit. There's also an inherent gap between the sort of the model scenarios and real-world conditions. And as I've mentioned, we did not explicitly include equity metrics, and we'll hear from Marco later where they've actually incorporated that, and this allows you basically better, to examine trade-offs in a better way than we're able to do here. Though we thought that for kind of almost any design exercise that one is doing, looking at equity and distributional impacts is important, and that's probably more the direction that we've gone for it. Now, we do plan to incorporate some of these metrics in our formulation. We're also incorporating, so as we kind of go to the next level of detail, we're introducing our agent-based model for assignment and for demand. So there's a full-blown activity model that's going to redo the demand associated with these designs. We haven't done that yet, and that would then, of course, provide a much more nuanced understanding of demographics, and we can construct more meaningful distributional measures. And with that, some relevant references, if you're interested, also on Chicago. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you.